Those present understood the outcome before they understood what had happened. There was no fall, no raised voice, no visible force. Joe Louis had entered the session confident in what pressure reveals. 7 seconds later, the pressure was gone. What replaced it was not defeat, but clarity shared quietly without explanation. The room returned to stillness, carrying the knowledge that something fundamental had just been adjusted. The session was never intended to be remembered. It took place in a private training room, away from crowds and without schedule. No one had gathered with the expectation of witnessing anything unusual. The space existed for work, not for record. The room itself reflected that purpose. Plain walls, a floor worn smooth by repetition, light entering from one side, uneven and uncorrected. Nothing had been arranged to impress. There were no banners, no mirrors positioned for form checking, no sense of presentation. It was a place where efficiency mattered more than appearance. Bruce Lee was already there when others arrived, not warming up in the conventional sense, not stretching or rehearsing. He was moving slowly, deliberately, as if continuing something that had begun long before anyone else entered the room. His motions were compact, small steps, brief shifts of weight, hands adjusting position without emphasis. There was no visible tension in him, no anticipation. His breathing was steady, barely audible. The rhythm of his movement suggested familiarity, not preparation. This was not how he behaved before a demonstration. It was how he behaved during refinement. Those present took positions along the edges of the room. They did not cluster. They did not speak. Each found a place that allowed observation without interference. It was understood, without discussion, that this was not a session to interrupt. Bruce Lee did not acknowledge the observers, not because he was unaware of them, but because awareness did not require acknowledgement. His attention remained on balance, how his weight transferred from foot to foot, how his center aligned without effort. Each movement resolved completely before the next began. There was nothing dramatic to watch, no sharp techniques, no explosive speed. To someone unfamiliar with his approach, it might have appeared incomplete, but those who knew his habits recognized the intent. He was reducing motion, not increasing it, eliminating what was unnecessary. The environment reinforced this discipline. Without noise or distraction, even minor adjustments became visible. A half step that corrected alignment, a pause that prevented overcommitment. The room amplified restraint. When Joe Louis arrived, the atmosphere did not change immediately. The door opened. Footsteps entered. Bruce Lee continued moving as he had been. There was no pause, no glance toward the sound. The session did not shift to accommodate a new presence. But for those watching, the room felt different, not tense, not confrontational, simply occupied in a new way. The space now held two reputations, both established elsewhere, neither dependent on the outcome of this meeting. The training continued, quiet, controlled, unremarkable to anyone expecting a display. And without announcement, without agreement, the conditions for comparison were already in place. Joe Louis did not arrive seeking confirmation. By the time he entered that room, his standing had already been established through competition and contact. He had faced resistance that did not yield easily. He had tested systems under rules, under pressure, and in public view. What he carried with him was not bravado, but familiarity with consequence. He stepped into the space without urgency. There was no effort to announce himself, no shift in demeanor meant to draw attention. His posture was composed, balanced in a way that came from years of conditioning rather than conscious adjustment. He observed first, allowing the room to speak before he did. Bruce Lee continued moving. There was no acknowledgement of arrival, and no visible change in rhythm. The work remained internal, small corrections, controlled transitions, pauses that appeared intentional rather than hesitant. The absence of reaction was not dismissive. It was consistent. Joe Louis watched carefully. Not the hands, not the speed. He paid attention to spacing, to how movement ended rather than how it began. He noticed how Bruce Lee's weight never seemed to linger between positions, how each step resolved cleanly before the next occurred. The room began to narrow in focus. Those present sensed it, though nothing overt had happened. Two approaches to combat, both tested, both respected, now shared the same space. There was no need for comparison to be stated. The implication existed on its own. Joe Louis removed his outer layer and set it aside. The gesture was simple, practical. It suggested readiness without aggression. Not a declaration, but a signal to himself as much as anyone else that he was present, attentive, prepared to engage if engagement emerged. Still, no words were exchanged. No challenge was offered. No invitation extended. In serious circles, such things are unnecessary. When skill is questioned, the question forms naturally through proximity and timing. Joe Louis adjusted his position slightly, stepping closer. Not into Bruce Lee's space, but near enough that distance became relevant. It was a controlled advance, measured and deliberate, the kind used to gather information rather than provoke reaction. Bruce Lee finished the movement he was in and became still, not abruptly, not defensively. The stillness arrived as a natural conclusion, as if he had reached the end of a sentence. His posture remained relaxed, his hands low, his attention distributed rather than fixed. The room understood what had formed. This was not a contest arranged in advance. It was not a lesson planned for others. It was a meeting of capability, unfolding without ceremony. Joe Louis did not smile. He did not tense. He simply stood where he was, reading what was in front of him. The confidence he carried was intact, but it had shifted inward, sharpening rather than expanding. The comparison had not yet occurred, but the conditions were complete. And with that quiet alignment, the session moved toward its inevitable test. Nothing was announced, yet the atmosphere altered with precision. It was not tension in the conventional sense, no anxiety, no aggression, but a narrowing of attention. The room seemed to draw inward, as if excess space had been removed, leaving only what was necessary. Joe Louis shifted his stance slightly. The adjustment was subtle, almost instinctive. A repositioning of weight, a recalibration of distance. It was the kind of movement that did not seek engagement, but made engagement possible. Those familiar with pressure recognized it immediately. Bruce Lee did not mirror the adjustment. He did not square his shoulders or raise his hands. His posture remained open, almost casual. But within that openness was alignment, hips settled, spine balanced, feet placed with quiet intent. He appeared available rather than prepared, which made him difficult to read. The distance between them became the focal point, not measured in steps but in consequence. Close enough that a decision would matter, far enough that restraint still governed the moment. Neither man crossed it. Observers became acutely aware of their own presence. They did not move, they did not shift their weight. Conversation felt impossible, not because it was forbidden, but because it would have broken something delicate and exact. Silence was not imposed, it was chosen. Joe Louis tested the space with a small advance. Not an attack, not even a feint. It was a probe, meant to elicit reaction, to reveal how quickly intention became motion. His approach was controlled, professional, stripped of excess. Bruce Lee did not retreat. He did not advance either. He remained where he was, as if the space already belonged to him, not by claim, but by understanding. His gaze did not fix on Joe Louis's hands or shoulders. It moved calmly, registering position without attachment. The absence of reaction became its own signal. What Joe Louis encountered was not resistance, but containment.
The space he expected to occupy did not invite him in. It did not oppose him. It simply remained unavailable. Time slowed without anyone counting it.
The moment stretched, not because of hesitation, but because nothing needed to be rushed. Both men understood that whatever happened next would be brief. Prolongation would only dilute clarity. Joe Louis adjusted again, slightly closer now. The pressure increased, not outwardly but internally. His posture remained composed, but his attention sharpened. The test was no longer theoretical. It was imminent. Bruce Lee's breathing remained unchanged. His stillness was not rigid. It was responsive, like water held in shape without effort. Those watching sensed it then, not as certainty of outcome, but as certainty of control. The challenge, though never spoken, was fully formed. The question was no longer whether something would happen. It was how little would be required. What followed was not dramatic enough to mark clearly. Those closest would later disagree on the exact sequence, not because it was confusing, but because it was brief. The exchange resisted narration. It did not unfold in steps. It was resolved. Joe Louis initiated the pressure with intent, not a full commitment, and not a gesture meant for display. It was a measured action, calibrated to reveal timing and control, the kind of movement that, under ordinary circumstances, forces an answer. Bruce Lee answered without appearing to do so. There was no preparatory motion, no visible decision. His body adjusted as a single unit, not faster than expected, but earlier. The shift was slight, so slight that it seemed less like movement and more like correction. For an instant, the space between them collapsed, not through collision, but through redirection. Joe Louis's forward line met absence where he anticipated presence. His balance was not taken violently. It was interrupted, enough to matter, not enough to escalate. Contact occurred briefly. It was functional, not expressive. No strike landed with force meant to harm. Instead, there was placement, pressure, and release, each arriving and ending before the next could be isolated. What mattered was not what was done, but what was denied. The exchange ended almost as soon as it began. 7 seconds later, no more than that, the question that had formed in the room no longer required an answer. There was nothing left to test. Joe Louis remained upright. He did not stumble or fall, but his position had changed in a way that could not be ignored. He stood where he had not intended to stand, his structure intact but his momentum dissolved. Bruce Lee stepped back to where he had been. The movement was unremarkable, almost dismissive in its simplicity. His breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged. If not for the stillness in the room, it might have appeared that nothing had occurred. Silence followed immediately, not shock, not awe, recognition. Those present understood they had not witnessed a technique to be copied, but a decision made at the earliest possible moment. Joe Louis did not attempt to continue. There was no follow-up, no adjustment meant to recover initiative. He absorbed the information as it arrived, without protest and without justification. What had ended was not an exchange, it was a comparison. And in that quiet resolution, the 7 seconds acquired their weight. The room did not react. There was no audible response to mark the end of the exchange. No exhale, no murmured commentary. The silence that followed was not imposed by surprise, but by understanding. Everyone present recognized that nothing more was required. Joe Louis remained still for a moment longer. He did not step away immediately, and he did not attempt to reframe what had just occurred. His posture was composed, but his attention had turned inward. The energy he had carried into the test was no longer directed outward. It had been interrupted, then reorganized. Bruce Lee did not wait for acknowledgement. He turned back toward the space he had been using and resumed his quiet movement. There was no pause to assess the room, no glance to measure reaction. His return to training was seamless, as if the moment had concluded before it had registered. This response clarified more than words could have. There was no effort to establish hierarchy, no attempt to reinforce what had been shown. The absence of explanation allowed the moment to stand on its own terms, unprotected by interpretation. Joe Louis adjusted his stance subtly, not to prepare for another exchange, but to release the one that had ended. His shoulders settled, his weight redistributed. It was a physical acknowledgement, not of loss, but of information received. No one moved to fill the silence. Those present sensed that speaking would reduce the clarity of what they had witnessed. Language would have introduced arguments where none existed. The quiet preserved the integrity of the moment. Joe Louis did not dispute the outcome. There was nothing to contest. No rule had been broken, no boundary crossed. The test had been answered in a manner consistent with its intent. In serious practice, that is sufficient. Bruce Lee continued refining small details, a slight shift of foot placement, a correction of angle, the same work he had been doing before the test formed. His focus had not expanded or narrowed, it had simply returned. The recognition was mutual, though unspoken. One man had asked a question through pressure. The other had answered through absence. Both understood what that meant. And in the continued stillness, the moment settled, not as a victory claimed, but as a reality accepted. The discussion did not happen in the room. No one gathered afterward to analyze what they had seen. The moment resisted that kind of treatment. It required distance, not immediacy. Only later, in smaller conversations, did it begin to surface, not as an incident, but as a reference. Joe Louis addressed it indirectly. When asked about the session, he did not describe a loss or a lesson delivered. He spoke instead about timing, about how little margin there had been between intention and interruption. He did not dramatize it. He did not minimize it. He treated it as information absorbed and stored. Those who trained with him noticed a change that was difficult to define, not in confidence and not in capability. The adjustment was subtler. His approach to distance became more conservative. His entries are more selective. He began to speak less about imposing pressure and more about when pressure should not be applied at all. Bruce Lee did not revisit the moment. He did not reference it in training, and he did not alter his demeanor toward Joe Louis afterward. There was no sense that something unresolved remained between them. Whatever had occurred belonged fully to the past the moment it ended. Among the witnesses, understanding deepened quietly. They did not frame what they had seen as dominance or superiority. They spoke instead about efficiency, about how little movement had been required, how early the decision had been made. The absence of excess became the central detail. Language around training began to shift. Terms like commitment and power gave way to access and timing. These changes were not announced or attributed. They emerged organically, shaped by what had been observed rather than what had been taught. Joe Louis continued his own path without deviation. His accomplishments were not diminished, and his authority remained intact. But those who listened closely heard a new restraint in how he evaluated exchanges. The test had not weakened him. It had refined his sense of risk. The recalibration extended beyond individuals. It affected how moments of contact were understood within that circle. The idea that control could be established without escalation became less theoretical and more accepted. What settled was not a doctrine. It was an adjustment in perception. And as time passed, the 7 seconds grew quieter, not because they were forgotten, but because they no longer required explanation. The account did not move quickly. There was no urgency to share it, no impulse to frame it as something remarkable. It passed the way certain moments do, between people who trusted one another's judgment, in conversations that did not seek attention. When it was mentioned briefly, often as an aside, a sentence without emphasis. Someone would say they had been present during a private session, that something had been tested, that it had ended sooner than expected. Then the conversation would move on. Those who heard it for the first time usually pressed for details. What exactly happened? What technique was used? How did it end? The answers disappointed them. There was no sequence to describe, no movement dramatic enough to hold on to. The witnesses spoke instead about spacing, about timing, about how quickly certainty replaced momentum. As the story traveled, it became smaller, not diminished but compressed. Names remained. The setting remained vague. The duration stayed consistent. What disappeared were explanations. The more it was told, the less there was to say. People who respected Joe Louis listened carefully to what was not denied. He did not reframe the moment. He did not correct others' understanding. His restraint carried weight. In disciplines where credibility is earned through contact, silence often speaks more clearly than defense. Those familiar with Bruce Lee recognized the pattern. They had heard similar accounts before. Encounters that ended without spectacle, moments that refused to become demonstrations. This story did not stand apart. It fit into a larger body of quiet confirmations. Over time, the story stopped being introduced as a comparison. It was no longer about who faced whom. It became an example referenced obliquely when discussions turned to control, to economy, to what happens when excess is removed early enough. The lack of embellishment protected it. There were no exaggerations to challenge, no claims to debunk. Its credibility rested in its restraint. People who heard it sensed that if more had happened, more would have been said. Eventually, the story settled into informal history. Not recorded, not cited, but acknowledged. It existed as a shared understanding rather than a narrated event. A quiet measure passed between practitioners who valued clarity over display. And in that careful transmission, the moment endured, not because it demanded attention, but because it did not. Years passed without the moment being fixed to a date. No one marked an anniversary. No one returned to the room to recall it. The space itself changed, as such places always do. New floors laid, walls repainted, different voices filling the air. Whatever had occurred there left no physical trace. Yet among those who had been present, it remained intact. Not vivid, not replayed, but settled. It surfaced occasionally when discussions drifted toward fundamentals. What truly mattered when systems met, when certainty replaced effort. The reference was never dramatic. It did not need to be. Joe Louis's career continued, publicly and decisively. He accumulated accomplishments that stood on their own. His authority was not revised by a private session few could describe. But over time, those who trained with him noticed how carefully he chose moments of engagement. His understanding of distance matured into something quieter, more selective. He did not credit a single incident. He did not need to. Bruce Lee's path moved forward without pause. The encounter did not alter his direction because it aligned with it. He continued to strip away excess, to refine efficiency, to pursue clarity over confirmation. He did not speak of the session, and he did not allow it to define him. It was one moment among many, resolved and released. As Bruce Lee's reputation expanded, stories gathered around it. Some grew louder with repetition, some gained color they had never possessed. This one remained unchanged. Its resistance to expansion became its distinguishing feature. It stayed simple, almost austere. Among serious practitioners, the story became a reference point, not for emulation and not for comparison. It served as a reminder that the most decisive moments often leave the least behind. That mastery does not require announcement, and control does not need display. There was no concluding statement made about what happened. No morals are drawn explicitly. The meaning emerged through behavior, through altered priorities, quieter confidence, and a shared understanding that certain questions, once answered, do not need to be asked again. In time, the 7 seconds ceased to be measured. They became symbolic, standing in for something broader and more difficult to articulate. A moment when pressure dissolved without resistance, when certainty replaced effort. What endured was not the action itself. It was the absence that followed, the silence that remained long enough to teach and quiet enough to last.